So now we're going to get started with master detail, which is a feature that allows us to render a number of grids nested within our grid. It's very easy to get started with this. All we have to do is include this flag master detail in our grid options and this detail cell renderer params object. Simply by including the master detail flag, our grid has already transformed. You can see that we have a number of group nodes here, which are called our master nodes. And this blank space right here is called our detail node, which is currently blank because we haven't included our detail cell renderer params object. So if we do that, you can see that we'll have a fully fledged master detail grid activated. The detail cell renderer params object has two properties, the detail grid options and the get detail row data callback. In the detail grid options, it's very similar to any other grid. We define our column definitions, which we have here. We have 5 columns, which are rendered all over there. And we also have this onFirstDataRendered grid event that we're listening to size the columns of the detailed grid to fit the available space. In the get detail row data callback, we have this line here, params.success callback, params.data.callRecords, which is basically telling our detail node where to find the detailed data on the master node. If that sounds a little bit confusing, we can just log out right here where to find the first, we'll log out right here the first node of our data. So if we do that and open up the console, you'll see a number of warnings here. This is because this example doesn't have a valid AG grid license. This is just for simple demonstration purposes. If you are going to use AG grid, we recommend that you get a license. So let's go ahead and refresh. And we can see our first row logged out in the console. Nora Thomas, which is right here, and some of her details. And this call records property contains all of her detail data, which is then passed to our detail grid and rendered. Now we're going to be taking a look at how to access the API of our detail grids. So the grid gives us 2 ways to do this primarily. The first of which is highlighted right over here on line 67, where we call gridoptions.api get detail grid info, and we pass the ID of the detail grid we're looking to get access to. This is going to return the detail grid, and from there we have access to its API, its column API, and such. The second method to get access to a detail grid is to iterate over all detail grids with the callback with the grid method gridoptions.api for each detail grid info. Here we pass a callback, which we will run on all of our detail grids, and we get the same object, detail grid info, which gives us access to its API and column API. So it's demonstrated here in this example with 4 buttons: edit master, stop edit master, edit detail, and stop edit detail. If we click edit master, we can see right here that this cell has entered edit mode, and the code for which is right here highlighted. First of all, we iterate over all detail grids and stop editing on them. And then we call gridoptions.api.startEditingCell, and we pass the params to locate the cell that we'd like to enter edit mode. Stop editing master, if we click it, we'll simply call gridoptions.api.stopEditing. Edit detail, we'll firstly call gridoptions.api.stopEditing to stop editing in our master grid, and then we'll get a specific detail grid that we'd like to have access to its API, and call detailgrid.api.startEditingCell and pass the params needed to highlight and this cell into edit mode. Finally, stop edit detail will iterate over all detail grids and call detailgridinfo.api.stopEditing. By default, if you scroll horizontally on a grid, you'll see this is the behavior. The detail grid is kind of in a sticky position as the master grid scrolls. If you'd like to change this, you just need to include the flag embed full width rows in your grid options, and this will allow you to sync the scrolling between the master and the detail grids. Next, we're going to work on customizing our detail grids using a template. So in our detail cell renderer params, we can add this property template and pass it a HTML string to customize our detail grid, as you'll see in a second. So here you have it, called details right there. Now the most important part of doing this is to include the ref attribute of eDetailGrid on the element that you want to render the grid within. So here we have a div with a ref attribute of eDetailGrid, and that's where the grid is going to be rendered. Now we can actually do this as well with a function. So let's go ahead and update this. And the advantage of doing so is we get access to the node of the master node in the detail grid that's going to be rendered there. So for example, we can do something like this. And instead of writing core details here, we'll do this. And there you have it right there. You can see this is now going to dynamically fetch the name for each detail grid. Now we're going to take full control of our detail nodes using a detail cell renderer. This is using an ES5 class syntax. The most important methods which have to be included on every detail cell renderer in order to integrate it with the grid are the init method and the getGUI method. You also have the option of including a destroy method, which is going to run whenever your component, your detail cell renderer, is removed from the grid. In this destroy method, you can do any cleanup you want, such as removing event listeners or removing detail grid info from the grid, which I'll get to later. So let's start off in our init method. First of all, we create a div, and we get a template for the div using this .getTemplate params.data. And that's going to return a HTML string, which is highlighted here, with the layout of the detail node. So that's illustrated right here. Next, we save a reference to the API of the master node and a reference to the row index of the master node. And then we're going to call setup detail grid, passing the row data that we'd like to display in the detail grid, which is going to be the call records property of our master node's data. It's going to be an array. We're also going to pass the master node's API and the API and the row index position of the master node. Now in our setup detail grid method, first of all, we query the div that we'd like to contain our grid within, and then we instantiate a new grid using agGrid, new agGrid.grid. The first property passing is the DOM element, the DOM node that we'd like to mount the grid on. And the second property is the grid options for our grid. Now this is just the same as any other grid. So we're going to include column definitions, row data, and this part's very important, this onGrid ready event handler. Now in this onGrid ready event handler, we're setting up a custom ID for our detail grid, and we're creating the grid info object, which is going to give us access to the API and the column API of our detail grids. In the last video, we showed how when you iterate over all detail grids, you get access to this object right here. So it's very important that you include it and then run masterGrid API.add detail grid info, passing the ID and the grid info object for your detail grid. Finally, just make sure that you include the getGUI method and return the eGUI, which is going to contain your detail node. Now, if you'd like to integrate this into the grid, this is how you do so. In gridOptions.components, this object, you're going to use a string here. You can call it whatever you like. Here we've named it my detail cell renderer, and we're going to give a reference to our detail cell renderer class. And finally, in gridOptions.detail cell renderer, we'll pass the string which correlates to the key in the components object for our detail cell renderer. Next, we're going to use a detail cell renderer to render something other than a detail grid. You can see here that in this example that we're actually rendering a form. So if we take a look at our detail cell renderer file, you'll see that we've only included the mandatory methods for a detail cell renderer, being the init method and the getGUI method. In our init method, we're creating a div element, and then we're using the inner HTML property to populate it with a HTML string. This is going to dynamically attach the call ID, the number, and the direction of each record, the first record of each detail grid. We're binding our detail cell renderer to our grid using the same method that we did before. In our gridOptions.component object, we're using a custom key and giving a reference to our class, to the class for our detail cell renderer. And then in grid options.detail cell renderer, we're passing a string of that key, which is my detail cell renderer. Okay, so up until now, we've been using the same kind of renderers for each of our detail nodes. In this example, we're going to leverage the detail cell renderer params, what we pass to it. Instead of being an object, we're going to pass a function, and that will allow us to render different grids for different nodes. So as you can see here on the right, this is the end result. For anyone named Mila Smith or Harper Johnson, that's these two nodes right here, we're going to have 2 columns in our detail nodes. And for the rest of them, we're going to have 4 columns. So if we open up Harper Smith, we'll see she should have 2 columns, and everyone else will have 4 columns. Now, this is very simple to do. All we have to do is pass a function, as mentioned earlier, to the detail cell renderer params. And here we're constructing our params object as we would normally. However, here we're doing an if statement and checking the name of the current node we're on when we're creating our detail cell renderer params. And if it's one of these 2 names, we'll define our column defs to have these 2 fields, call ID and number. And otherwise, we'll have call ID, direction, duration, and switch code. So next, we're going to take a look at a situation where you wouldn't actually want to render a detail grid for each one of your top level nodes. Looking at the grid here on the right, you can see that Mila Smith does have a number of children in her call records array, a number of items that we would like to render onto the screen as a grid. However, looking at the first node, Nora Thomas, there are no children in this array, and this master detail grid will always be rendered blank. So if you would like to render just a regular node here, without the ability to expand and show you a detail grid, you can include this callback is row master in your grid options. This is going to run on each data item in your data set, and there you can take a look at the properties and return a Boolean value with whether or not you would like to render a detail grid for that node. So as you can see here, Nora Thomas does not have a chevron, and we can't expand it to open a master detail grid. Whereas Mila Smith and some of the other nodes, which do have children in the call records array, render master detail configurations. So in this next example, we're going to be nesting master detail grids within one another. This is easy to do because each detail grid is essentially just another grid. So if we take a look at our grid options here, you can see we've included our master detail flag and our detail cell renderer params object. The 2 important keys that we need to include here are the detail grid options and the get detail row data, which have been implemented. The interesting thing in this example is our detail grid options is rendering another master detail grid. So as you can see here on line 22, we've included the flag again, master detail, and another detail cell renderer params object. Within this detail cell renderer params object, we've included our get detail row data callback to pass the row data for our innermost grid, and we've included the detail grid options for our innermost grid, where we just define some columns and our listener for the on first data rendered event. So taking a look at it, we now have 3 layers of grids within one another. In this next example, we're going to be configuring the height of our detail nodes. There are 2 ways to do this. We can do it statically and dynamically, statically being the easier of the 2. To do this statically, you simply need to include the detail row height property in grid options. Now we've set each detail node to be a height of 350 pixels. And if we expand our master nodes, we'll see indeed that each detail node, irrespective of how many nodes are within the detail grid, are still rendering as 350 pixels tall. To set this up to be dynamic, we're going to use the get row height property, which will run on all nodes, master and detail alike. Here, we're using a conditional statement where we're checking if a node is a detail node, and there we are multiplying the number of records within that detail grid by 28, the height of each node, and adding on an offset of 80 to that and returning that to be the height of our detail nodes. If a node is a master node, we'll return 60 pixels so that they're a bit taller. Note, we can also use this API call in the onGridReady event handler to set the DOM to auto height in our detail nodes. The effect being that there's no scrolling now in the detail nodes. Each detail grid renders exactly at the correct height. Enabling filtering and sorting in our detail grids is just as easy as it is with any other grid. We can elect to either include the filter and sortable flags on our individual columns, or we can use a default coldef object and pass them in there. So in this example, I'll just add filtering to our detail grids. And now it's easy enough to filter. Just using this filter menu, we could filter. It's worth noting that it's very easy to load your detail nodes asynchronously. This is useful if you'd like to query your detail nodes from a database. If we take a look at our getDetailRowData method in the detail cell renderer params object, we'll see that one of the arguments passed to this method is a callback that we're supposed to invoke with our detail rows. This callback right here, params.successCallback. That can be done synchronously, as shown in previous examples, or asynchronously. Here we're using a timeout to asynchronously invoke the success callback with our detail rows. And if we expand a group node, you'll see that it will take 3 seconds to load the data in a node. So 1, 2, 3, there we have it. Now I'm going to show you how to keep context in your detail nodes. If we take a look at this detail grid here and sort by this call ID column, we'll give it a descending sort. And now if we collapse this group node and re-expand it, we'll see that our sorting is no longer applied. The reason for this is because detail nodes are destroyed and recreated whenever a group node is collapsed or expanded. So to get around this, the grid has provided us with 2 properties that we can include in our grid options: keep detail rows and keep detail rows count. Keep detail rows is a boolean, and it's basically telling our grid not to destroy our detail nodes when collapsing them, and that will allow us to maintain whatever state's in them. Now, this can become expensive if you're using many detail grids. So the keep detail rows count property tells AGGrid the maximum number of detail nodes to keep rendered at any one point. So if we go ahead and include these 2 now, we'll see that we can maintain state in up to 2 detail nodes. We can sort on this column, and let's go ahead and also sort on this column. And now if we expand the second node, we'll see that our sort is maintained, and the first one, our sort is also maintained here. By the way, this isn't just for sorting, it's for any kind of state. So that could be column position, sorting, filtering, etc. Now, if we were to go beyond 2, we'll see that the first one that we've kept is removed. So let's sort here. And now we should expect that this node here no longer has any sorts being applied to it. Now I'll show you how you can get around an issue you may experience when using master detail with transaction updates. In the example shown, we're using a set interval to continuously update cells in our master nodes with a transaction update. You can see the updated cells are highlighted. This becomes an issue when you like to maintain context in your detail grid, as updating a master node will cause its detail node to refresh and lose any context in the detail grid. So I'll go ahead and show you how that looks. If we were to sort on this column here in our detail grid, when the master node refreshes, we lose all state in our detail grid. To get around this, we can include the suppress refresh flag in our detail cell renderer params object, which will now stop a detail node refreshing and its subsequent detail grid from being destroyed and recreated whenever our master node is updated. So we can just go ahead and include this flag. And now we can sort on this column, perhaps even doing multiple sorts. And we keep context in our detail grid. Let's talk about how you can export master detail grids. The default behavior when exporting a master detail grid is to only export the master nodes. So if we export this through our context menu, you'll see that there's no reference to our detail nodes. This also won't work if we try to export from within a detail grid. The reason for this being is that a detail grid is just another instance of AG grid, so there's no relationship from there to the master node. To do this to get the desired result, we need to include this get custom content below row callback inside of our default export params object. So if we go ahead and uncomment that, you'll see that we're returning this array here. Now the easiest way to explain this is to log it out to the console so you can see what we're expecting. So we'll turn this into a variable. And now, if we open up the console, firstly, you're going to see a number of errors. This is just because we're using AG Grid Enterprise without a license. We do recommend that if you're going to use AG Grid in your project, that you do so with a license. So now if we do an export, you'll see that we've logged a number of arrays into the console. Each array here corresponds to one of the nodes being in our master grid. If we open this up, you'll see that each array has a number of sub-arrays within it, and these all represent rows within our grid that we like to put on our Excel spreadsheet. The first row being the header. So as you can see here, we've got a number of cells being defined in objects. If you take a look at our export, if we take a closer look at one of these cells here, you'll see that we've defined 3 properties: style ID, data, and ref. Ref is going to be where we want to position our cell in our Excel spreadsheet. As you can see here, B3 corresponds to this cell right here. The style ID is used for styling. It works in conjunction with this Excel styles object array that we provide in our grid options. You can see the style ID of header corresponds with this ID, header, and then the styling is located in this property here, interior, where we pass an object with the styles that we'd like to apply in Excel. Finally, we also have this data object, which contains the value that we'd like to render in Excel and the values type. So we have a string of call ID, as you can see right here. This is for a header cell. Let's take a look at a random cell within our body. So we'll take a look at this cell right here, D11. If you take a look, D11 is going to be located here. And this object is D11's right there. It has a style ID of body, which again corresponds to an ID in our Excel styles. Here are the stylings that are going to be applied in Excel. And then we have the data object, which defines a string type, and a value of some sort of phone number. As you can see here, the 2 numbers correlate. So there you have it, how to configure an export with master detail.